There you go.
Good.
Um,
Mm.
uh, Good evening, Steve Keen. I know it's morning where you are, but it's evening where I am. I seem to be do these overseas interviews where we're at polar ends of the day, but I'm really kind of excited to talk to you because it's been quite a long time, I think, since we last had a conversation.
It's been at least a decade. That's
This-
ridiculous. I mean,
Well, a decade since we met in person, that would be for sure.
yeah,
But
in person.
um,
Some emails and stuff since then, but yeah.
yeah, I did interview. I think the last interview I did with you. I do remember it because we touched on the climate stuff.
Mm. Oh, that's right. That's in the last 6 years in that case for sure.
Yes. And then this is what happened. This is why you're here. Because I was looking at YouTube one night
Oh
and
yeah.
on my premium page, because I am subscribed to you now, but I wasn't at that point. But one of
Mm.
your videos appeared on my premium page with like over 200,000 views, and it was on
Mm.
what's going to happen to Australian housing. And I
There
thought,
you go.
I'll bookmark that to watch it, a little bit later. And then I just kept getting these text messages of people sending me the video. Have you seen this? Have you seen this?
Well,
So,
that's why it got 200,000 plus views. That's right. Yeah,
well,
people referring it around.
I think it was the headline about Australian housing. It was like, if there's ever a headline to get the Australians watching, let's just put a headline with housing. What's going to happen? Crash, boom,
I
bust.
know, I know, I know. It's in some ways it's the lowest common denominator. I mean, what works on YouTube is stuff that work functions as clickbait, and people complain about all the elements that are there, but the reason they're there because it is clickbait. So,
Yes.
like my team that puts together my videos for me describes me as top economist. And
Mm.
top economist, and people get pissed off me calling myself a top economist. I do have an actual verification for that. I'm listed in the top 20 academic influencers who are economists. But the thing is, if you don't have top there, YouTube promotes it less.
Mm.
So you're
Mm.
stuck with this irony. If you want to get seen, you've got to have a clickbait title.
If you don't know how to market, you'll die. And
Yeah.
Leith Consulin, it's funny because then I sent it to Leith and I said, "Oh, you and me should have a chat with Steve." And he didn't come back to me. And then I texted him the other day. I said, "Oh, I'm already talking to Steve." So my listeners will know I'm Leith Van Onselen, who is the
Yeah, I know.
of macro business, and he's the king of clickbait headlines. In fact, they
Is
make
he? Okay.
most of macro businesses money come through advertising, and so they do the headline thing, and then that sort of attracts the Google traffic and the advertising
Mm,
and everything. So they sort of do all right with it. But yeah, I was kind of thinking because as before we sort of I came on video and I clicked record and everything. I was watching a few videos of yours, but and a lot of your videos are so focused on how badly economics is taught. And,
mm.
it's reminding me of really, probably because, we have sort of quite a long history of sort of knowing each other. But I learned so much from you in the early days. When I first connected with people like Philip Seuss,
Yeah.
and he was doing a lot with you in those days, and you had your book out, Debunking Economics. And I don't know whether that was around the time of the 2008 crash or whether it came like a little bit after it.
No, I wrote the first edition in 1999, 2000, and published in 2001, and that was the second edition I published in 2011. So
Right. Okay.
one reason to write the book in the first place was that I thought a financial crash of some description was coming, and I had to be warning people it's because the economic theory itself is literally saying, "Hey, that's a nice brick wall. Why don't you drive head face into it? You'll get to the other side of the mountain much more quickly if you drive into the brick wall."
Yeah.
And I mean, of course, I'm being facetious, but the level of stupidity in mainstream economics is just breathtaking. And so I stuck my neck out saying all those things in 2001 and then now 2007 occurred. When I got involved in a court case over predatory lending. And that was when I first wrote the first edition of Debunking Economics. What I intended doing was collecting together all the material I knew, critiquing mainstream economics and putting it into one overall source, because there's hundreds, thousands of academic papers that point out fundamental flaws in mainstream economics. And I read them all over the last 40 years. I thought, well, I know so many people find themselves in a government committee where they're fighting with an economist from Treasury or something like, or an economist from housing and construction, or economists from some bloody where, and they were always snowed. The economists would say, oh, the marginal cost is blah, and etc. And so look, I want to tell you this. Here's to understand their jargon and why they're wrong and why they don't know they're wrong. So that's why I wrote the first edition. And then the predatory lending case got me onto the whole housing, more housing debt, more private debt issue. And then, that's been my life ever since.
And that book was really life-changing for me when I came across that, because when we got to 2008, and I remember I remember it well because I was working in the property industry, and then I wasn't working in the property industry because 2008 hit, and we, like, half the industry kind of lost its job. And when I talk to people back about that time, they say, oh yeah, but Australia didn't go into recession and it wasn't that bad. But it really was when you were impacted with it on the ground, and in the property industry, we all were impacted.
Well, let's get one thing out of the way straight away, because I get rubbish by so many Australians. Say, you said there's going to be a housing market crash and there wasn't a house market crash. Yeah, I cop that on bloody YouTube all the damn time. The reason there wasn't a crash in Australia is largely because, and this sounds egotistical, it's because of me. Okay? So what happened was I was raising the alarm more effectively than anybody in any other country on the planet. Okay? So I know there were people in America, and I knew them personally, who were raising the alarm. People like Michael Hudson, obviously, and quite a few others. The people in England and so on. But I was the most effective in any particular country. So I ended up on the 7:30 report. If you remember that interview with Kerry O'Brien. And he interviewed me very favourably. I bet about 1/3 of the program. And the next day he interviewed Rudd, and he savaged the ankles off Rudd over my views on economics. 6 days later, the first home owners boost came out, doubling and trebling the amount of money they gave to first home buyers. Victoria kicked in with an extra $14,000 for purchases in the outer Melbourne ring and the rest of Victoria. So that was like $21,000 from the government for to buy a new house, 14 from the Victorian, that's 35 grand. That was far more than 10% of the purchase price of a house at the time. Of course, people bought into the property, and that caused the bubble to go back on again. And that's why Australia evaded the collapse during 2008, because credit never went negative. This is getting a bit technical here, but in America, the rate of change of private debt is credit. Now that's new loans are credit. So the new loans over a year in America in 2006 totaled 15% of GDP. Now I've done the mathematics since then and the logic to prove that the credit adds to aggregate demand and income. So the neoclassicals think credit just transfers spending power from one person to another, on the myth that banks enable Catherine to save so that Steve can borrow money. That's typical neoclassical economics. The real world is the bank creates debt and creates money at the same time. When you put that into a logical structure, you show that credit, which is the annual change in debt, is part of both aggregate demand and income, and of course it affects asset markets as well as product markets. So I've done all the proof of that, but I didn't have the proof at the time. So when America went from plus 15%, credit being plus 15% of GDP in 2006 to minus 5% of GDP in 2009, that's why they had such a severe downturn. Australia began, I think, at 24% of GDP as the rate of change of debt, almost all mortgages, of course, and it fell to plus 2. And then the vendors boost kicked in. And I nicknamed the first home owners boost the first home vendors boost. The vendors boost kicked in, credit went positive again, and Australia didn't have the negative credit that actually causes a serious recession. So it had a slowdown, but it didn't have negative growth. And the reason is, and I could have heard back from people in cabinet, not cabinet members, of course, but people who work with cabinet, and they said the proposal didn't come from Treasury, it came from the cabinet itself. And the guess is that it was possibly Rudd. I mean, one of the other ministers. Let's just give people lots of money for the housing. Let's get them buy houses, and it worked. But it trapped Australia in the one of the most expensive housing markets on the planet.
The history is really interesting, because I remember all the flack that you got, when you first started to make that call. And I've said it previously, I put out reports previously and done interviews with you previously where I've said that actually that call was spot on in terms of the timing. And you were reading it from, I always read things from a cycles perspective, because that's what
the 19-year real estate cycle stuff. Yeah.
I mean, but then you sort of came at it from a fundamentals perspective, and you got it spot on. And then of course what happened was 2008 came, half the people that were working in the property industry, we lost our jobs because buyers couldn't buy and the sellers couldn't sell. So the whole market grinds to a standstill, and it's a commission-based business. If you've got no money coming in, you drop your staff, you get rid of them. And the time where everyone got employed again was the time when the boost came in, and you saw like a 25% rise in the median price, between where we were at the bottom between 2009 and 2010. So whilst international property markets were, suffering into recession and foreclosures and everything, Australia was living up to its beautiful reputation. But the other thing that I remember around that time was it was that point, and it reminds me of what happened in the 1930s, where you had the Great Depression, and then everybody went, oh, I wonder why this has happened. And then all the investigation started, and there was a massive amount of academic research that was produced at the time as to why did this happen. And actually, that was when the research was produced on land cycles and property cycles by Wenslick and Hoyt and so forth. But 2008 was a bit like that, because what happened after 2008 was a whole string of events which kind of exposed this Wizard of Oz mythological idea of economics. And the US students came out and they said, our economics degree is not worth the paper that it's written on. And they protested on the street. It's so innocent when you look back compared to what we have now with the protests, where
there was a
the
student
Australian flag.
There was a student walkout from Gregory Mankew's course at the Harvard University. And so Mankew was still pumping out the dominant economic textbook on the planet. The students actually walked out of his lecture. And of course, he continues, he's actually offended rather than informed. And so the economics has become a completely delusional discipline. And I actually regard it as the probable way that human civilization will end is because they follow the advice of mainstream economists.
And one of the reasons that economics is so, once you start to study it, because I used to, not many people know this about me, but I used to be a professional classical musician. That was my
What were you?
passion.
What was your instrument?
I was a classical guitarist, and I went to the Royal Academy and Guildhall School of Drama and got a Fulbright scholarship and did all that. I had a hand injury. Actually, I've just started to take up the guitar again, so I'm quite pleased with myself. I'm back to playing some of my old repertoire, but and so if someone had told me then I'd be a real estate agent, they could have told me I'd be a funeral director, because
you would have believed it.
That's how impressed I would have been at the thought of having anything to do with economics or finance. But it has proved to be a bit of a passion. And the reason, I think this is the thing about economics is it's the fundamental way to happiness, if you like. Do you know what I'm trying to say? It's so important that we understand how economics works in order to eliminate poverty, because there is so much of a man-made construct with the monopolization, and because I start to talk very Georgish when I start to get into this subject. But when you understand it from the way that you teach it, which is the real world of how things work, then suddenly it becomes simple. Because if you don't have that real world view, you're so messed up thinking that it's some kind of difficult mathematical equation that if you don't know algebra, you're never going to be able to understand it. So we'll just leave it to Wizard of Oz, who's up there, who's convinced us that, all of these things are a problem. But no one better qualified to talk about. I mean, gosh, you've got the academic history of the walkouts on campus in Australia behind you as well. So, where do we start with this? When you start educating people on.
Well, it's really difficult, because if I put this up on a page of paper, intersecting lines, supply and demand, equilibrium, that mental construct has been shoved into everybody's brains, whether you've done an economics degree or not, ever since it was invented 150 years, 140 years ago, 135 to be more precise. The supply and demand diagram was first drawn by Alfred Marshall in 1890. Been around that length of time. It's such a plausible explanation for what sets behavior in markets, and of course capitalism is based on mainly voluntary exchange. Okay? So how do you set a price in a voluntary exchange between buyer and seller? Yeah, a couple of intersecting lines, that makes plenty of sense to me. And then everything is thought about in those terms, including the monetary system. And when you look at the logic, anybody can draw two lines on a piece of paper and say, and they're going to intersect. Okay, so you can say two lines, intersection, bang, end of problem. What's your next issue? But why are the lines where they are? Why do they intersect where they do? Why is the intersection stable? Uh, and all that work that's been done since Alfred Marshall first drew those diagrams has invalidated the concept itself completely. And it's only kept alive by the fact that economists themselves are so devoted to it that when they strike an absolute, lay down misere contradiction, they wave their hands and say, oh, I can work out an assumption to solve this problem. And they keep on as if it's still true. Now, to me, in that sense, supply and demand diagrams are like epicycles and equants and deference in the Ptolemaic system of astronomy. You can use it to predict where the planets are, but it's a completely false description of the solar system. And that's what we're stuck with. We've got an economic theory which is internally inconsistent in ways that the mainstream does not understand because, as I said, some of them have done the work and they get confronted by the logical contradictions. They're so wedded to the vision they've got that they make a crazy assumption to jump over the logical contradictions and stick with it. And therefore, we've got a theory which is as valid as Ptolemaic astronomy running our global economy right now, which is why we stuff up all the damn time.
Yes. And so with that supply demand thing, because that's
Yeah,
what I get. Many people will talk to me. They say, "Oh, it's just all about supply and demand."
I
They'll
know, and it
simplify this.
sounds,
That's
yeah,
all it
it's
is.
all about epicycles and perfect crystalline spheres, etc.,
Yes.
etc. Unfortunately, it takes a long time to get people to realize that, but you've really got to read the originals. And like I've made that comment about making an absurd assumption, and people really have no idea how absurd the assumptions are. So, if you know the name Paul Samuelson.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, to those who are listening and don't, Paul Samuelson was really the architect of modern economics, not Keynes. He wrote his PhD published his PhD in 1948, called Foundations of Economic Analysis, and it became the basic textbook of all economics all around the planet. So he invented all the background concepts that economists use. They think these are the things they call indifference curves to talk about people's consumption tastes, isoquants to talk about production. All that stuff came out of Samuelson. Then one of the issues was that everything in that theory is subjective. Your utility, your satisfaction is subjective. How do you convert that into something objective that you can measure, with mathematical models? You presume that there's the ratio of marginal utilities equals the ratio of marginal prices, and then the price system tells you the amount of utility people are getting out of different things, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a little curly. I know this is getting a bit deep, but give me a chance to see if I can explain it properly for people listening. What they can derive is using their idea of an individual's behaviour, an individual's subjective preferences, and then the objective prices that are applied in the economy and the income of that particular consumer. They can use that concept to derive a downward sloping demand curve for an individual. Okay? Lots of complicated steps, but they can do that, and it's logically sound as an analysis of a single individual. Then they say, how do we get the market demand curve? Now, the simpletons explain, oh, just add up all the individual demand curves. But there's a problem with that, and that is that when you derive the individual demand curve, you're presuming that a change in price of whichever commodity you're deriving a demand curve for, a change in the price of that commodity doesn't affect the income of the person you're considering. And that's a reasonable assumption. Okay? If we're going to change the price of bananas, it's highly unlikely that most individuals aren't going to have their income changed by a change in the price of bananas. Okay? So you can assume the income is constant. But in the real world, when you say for a market demand curve, you go from one person to, in Australia's case, 28, 30 million people. You've got the demand of 30 million people. Some of them will be banana producers. Okay? Caught up in the banana industry, et cetera, et cetera. People will have different tastes, whether they like or dislike bananas, yada, yada, yada. What it means is that point that you treat as fixed when you derive the demand curve for an individual, so you can change the price of a commodity and not change their income, that's no longer true. Now, when you do the mathematics, it turns out you cannot derive a downward sloping market demand curve by summing up the demand of individuals. Okay? It's just mathematically impossible. So when the economists who discovered that included Paul Samuelson. Okay? So having come up with the ideas in published his PhD thesis in 1948, in 1956 he realised this issue, so he decided to address it. And what he said was, well, he said point blank, you cannot derive a a pattern for the whole of society like the one for an individual. You can't get a set of indifference curves for a whole society. That's known. Okay, but he said, but that therefore means we can't drive a demand curve. But hang on a second. Individuals live in families. And all families are happy. We know this, don't we? They're all happy.
Mm.
So what a family can do is get together and shuffle income inside the family so that everybody in the family is happy, and then the family goes shopping. And then you get a downward sloping family demand curve. So what's the next step? Now I'm going to read, without stopping, a section in the paper where Samuelson tackled this issue. Okay?
Mm.
Bear with me. However, if within the family there can be assumed to take place an optimal reallocation of income so as to keep each member's daily expenditure of equal ethical worth, then there can be derived for the whole family a set of well-behaved indifference contours relating the total of what it consumes. The family can be said to act as if it maximises such a group preference function. Next paragraph. The same argument will apply to all of society if optimal reallocations of income can be assumed to keep the ethical worth of each person's marginal dollar equal. In other words, to prove that there's a downward sloping market demand curve, he's willing to assume there's a central authority that redistributes income before trade so everybody's happy with the distribution of income.
Mm.
That is brain dead crazy. Okay?
Mm.
That contradicts everything in neoclassical economics, and yet it's needed to hang on to the concept of a downward sloping market demand curve.
Mm.
So that intellectual garbage is the foundation of that meme, and that's why I want to get rid of it. It's just a completely wrong way to think about the economy. We need a different way, and I, as part of a community of scholars who've been opposed to the unreality and the fantasies that come out of both neoclassical at one stream and labour theory of value, Marxism at the other, we've tried to build a realistic foundation. I think I've finally put that all together. And you don't need all that micro garbage. You can start from the level of macroeconomic definitions. You get a much more realistic picture of how the economy functions. And that's what I'm teaching these days.
Mm. I want to dig into some more of those economic myths, but I think, from a broader concept, it kind of shows you the folly of belief, doesn't it? When your
Yes, it does. Yeah,
belief is
yeah.
you're so wedded to the belief that it becomes you defend it at all costs rather than nuance what you've learned, and then, accept that it might be wrong and then sort of move on. I mean, I've had to do it in my own career, is get to points where I've realized that what I'm talking about is completely wrong. I could talk about it, in terms of my real estate career, because when I first started out in real estate in Australia, I believed all the myths that we need
Yeah, right.
negative gearing to produce supply, that there weren't enough buyers, and so prices were all there was always there weren't enough properties, there
Yeah,
wasn't
therefore, yeah,
supply,
yeah.
prices were going to go. And I had articles that were published in the Age, because I used to write these articles that were so spooky that the Age would pick them up and like publish the stuff in the Age. And then in fact, it was so bad that at Prosper, of which, I then became like the longest serving president of Prosper
Yeah.
Australia. Prosper actually wrote a blog on me of like, this bubble, spruiking real estate agent has gone out and said this, and like I remember that. So there's quite an interesting history there, and I've obviously changed my thought patterns around it a little bit. But you know what? So I was kind of curious as to, did you flip belief, or did you kind of like always have?
There's a very important point in my life when I was an 18-year-old. Okay, and this is something that it's a remarkable piece of luck in some ways that happened, because I swallowed the whole stuff, just like you're saying. I believed all the stuff I learned at school. I learned a level of economics at school that it's equivalent to what people get in a university degree these days. It's been dumbed down that much over the last half century. Um, and so when I was reading Samuelson's text, I was reading Lipsy and stuff like that when I was in year 11 at school. And I read, like, there's a book by John Hicks on the trade cycle. I read that when I was 16. So, and that was not uncommon. I was obviously a bit of a nerd, but most of the nerds would have done it. So I believed the whole thing, and I was quite convinced of all. And there were, luckily, I didn't get published in the Age. So there was a student essay I wrote talking about how we should abolish both trade unions and monopolies, and that comes out of conventional economic theory. It teaches you that you get the best situation possible is where the market is in equilibrium. There's no concentrations of buyers or sellers. You don't have any monopoly. You don't have a trade union. Uh, but of course, the real world is you have trade unions and employer associations. They both exist. Okay. Now, so the theory taught you that if you get rid of those, the supply and demand rules, if they exist, they distort things. Get rid of them. Okay. Then in July, I think in 2000, July 1971, the new first year lecturer we had in the second term of the 3-term year was a guy called Frank Stillwell. You probably know Frank, don't you?
I do. He did one of the Henry George dinners, which was it was really one of the best that we'd had, one of the best
He's a
talks.
great bloke, a
Yeah.
great human being, let alone a great lecturer. Anyway, Frank was himself become a critic. He'd done his PhD not long before he got the job at Sydney. I think he was 28 when I was 18. Okay, that sort of age gap, and but he became cynical of the theory and found a whole range of reasons it was wrong. And one was the thing called the theory of the second best. Now that I think they got a Nobel Prize for the people who invented it, developed it. Lancaster is one. There's an Australian involved as well, from memory. And Frank, normally you'd learn that. If you'd learned it at all, you'd learn it in honours year or PhD qualifying. And by that stage, it was so sucked into the mainstream way of thinking that you treat this as an interesting little curly issue, nice little one to entertain the students in a subsequent quiz, but you don't really worry about it. Anyway, what the theory showed was that if you were 2 steps from the idea of perfection in the neoclassical mindset, moving 1 step closer provably made social welfare worse. So if you abolish the trade union or the employer association in the wage bargain, rather than getting to the point which the neoclassicals believe that the wage is equal to the marginal product of labour, that's their ideal situation, and both workers and capitalists benefit from that ideal situation, rather than moving towards it, you moved away. And you end up with lower welfare. And I remember just being in shock. And I even remember where I was sitting in the lecture theatre. So the Merriweather Lecture Theatre 1 in Sydney University. I was 2/3 up the left-hand side and about sort of the middle of the set of chairs. And I thought, holy shit, is this covered in my textbook? So I flicked through the textbook. I had 2 with me at the time, no sign of it. And I was just shocked. And I said, I've got to go down to the library and see. I didn't trust my textbook because here's my lecturer giving me an argument that is in the literature, and he showed the references, and it invalidated what the textbook said. Not that this is crazy. It's obvious that there are, more than 2 imperfections that take us away from the ideal situation these neoclassical economists behave. So in the real world, you can't do what they advise. Now that's crazy. If the theory tells you to do something and then being more realistic tells you it's a bad idea, there's something wrong with the theory itself. So I went down to the library, found that book, that article, and I was doing first year mathematics at the time, like not just the mathematics they teach economists, which is bullshit. I was doing calculus and algebra with damn good lecturers, so I could easily read the article, the mathematics included. Don't know that I could do it today, but I certainly could then. And it was watertight. And I thought, well, what else am I being lied to? So not knowing, this is the first time I'd been in the library looking at journal articles. So I thought, oh, the Economic Journal must be the top one. I'll grab a copy of that and see what's inside there. I found an article by a Marxist called Baduri. I thought, this is strange. What's a Marxist doing in economic textbooks? They kept on reading, and there I found this article by Samuelson again. And not this one, another one. And there was a debate called the Cambridge Controversies, which was a dispute between academics based in Cambridge University, UK, and Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which is Paul Samuelson again, in Cambridge. So it was in Cambridge, Boston. So it was called the Cambridge Controversies. And in it, Samuelson conceded defeat, which was realistic. I was quite, again, I actually might see if I can find that one. And since I read the other one into the literature, I'll give Samuelson a bit of a break and read this one as well. But I was going to turn sideways and look at my big screen.
Yeah, no, that's all right.
Yeah. So I thought, I'm being lied to. Not only was it like Samuelson conceded defeat in this debate, but did he admit it in his textbook? No. So at that point, I thought, I'm just not going to touch the textbooks anymore. I expect them to lie to me. Whether they know they're lying or not, most of them don't know they're lying. But I started reading the journals, and then I realized this incredible fragility of this theory that had, until this stage, I believed implicitly. So from that point on, I became an implacable opponent of this stuff, and it hasn't changed. It's
Mm,
worse now than it was when I was a critic of it.
mm. The textbooks, have they changed? Or are they
No,
still the same
they're
textbooks?
worse. They're worse. They're more simplistic. Like, for example, the concept of indifference curves was the very first thing I learned in first year at university. And this was, the idea is, for those who aren't familiar with it, and please don't get familiar with it, but it's like when you're looking at a weather map, you'll see isobars, and those are points, lines that join points of equal pressure. Okay. Well, the idea of indifference curves are there are lines that join uh, uh, combinations of commodities of equal utility to the buyer with vastly different amounts of commodities inside them. And then there's the mathematics of all that. You've got to do what they call the Driver-Slutsky equation and Hicksian compensated demand curves and all this sort of shit. And
Mm,
I learned it implicitly. That is now an advanced topic at the back of the Mankiw textbook I was mentioning earlier, and that doesn't go into all the detail that I went into.
mm,
So yeah, you had a really deep introduction to it, and yet there's was just these days they've dumbed it down, and it's being dumbed down. You don't even begin to see some of the issues that might be a problem.
mm. And you know, the interesting thing about this is that, you know, you hear a lot of things about people talking about, you know, one world governments and how to control the world and everything.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Whenever I hear something like that, I always kind of think back to, you know, like how do you actually change the consciousness of people? And it is sort of through education, isn't it? Because I think back to Fred Harrison's book, you know, the Corruption of Economics that he wrote with Mason Gaffney, who's now passed. I think he passed away. It was very recently, sort of during COVID.
yeah.
And you know, their theory in that book was that you know, land had been written out of the economic textbooks, that
Mm.
we'd got these two factors of production, and it was done by sort of bribing the PhD students who became the professors of the universities, who then, you know, sort of oversaw how things were being taught. And the other thing it reminds me of is Graham. Is it Graham Hancock, the guy that went out? I think he was a journalist, and then he decided that he was going to go out. He found some discrepancies in the historical record that when
Oh
he
yeah, yeah. The ancient. I've seen his show. Yeah,
yeah. So then you find out that, hang on a second, you know, this concept that we sort of came up through these different ages, you know, the Bronze Age and you know, the Iron Age and all of that
mm.
is actually not quite as the textbook teaches. But yet the textbooks are out there still teaching all of this stuff. I think
Yeah. I mean,
it's worse
we're going to
now
have more time.
because
Yeah,
you've got ChatGPT now, which just, you know, scrapes from all of this mollycoddled information, you know, of like, you know, you ask it a question and then you sort of get some kind of answer that's likely scraped from the bank of knowledge that's been manipulated by theories in textbooks that have been written by people and somehow managed to stick like glue.
yeah. I mean, I'm no great fan of conspiracy theories in general, as you know. Hancock has possibly identified something important. I mean, some of what he says, I think, is just improbable, because when you know the pattern of global average temperatures, the thought
Mm.
that there was a previous society that was as advanced as we are, and then got wiped out in what 12. I think it's the younger Dryas event. I think that's what he points to.
I thought he got
12,500 years ago.
mm.
Um, the thought that there was an advanced civilization then with our level of technology, I just, sorry, don't swallow that one. But the possibility of earlier start to civilization, that it wasn't necessarily farming that led to the first structures put together. The one in Turkey that he talks about. And if you've ever read The Clan of the Cave Bear, that series by Jean Earl, have you read that at all?
No, I've heard about it. I haven't read it. I think
Yeah.
I got it on
The
Audible.
first, don't bother with Volume 6. Volume 6 I threw in the garbage bin. Okay. The author lost it over time, but the first four are based very strongly on research by anthropologists and archaeologists into early Cro-Magnon societies. And what you find is used to live in small groups, like about 150, but they lived in large tribes as well, 10,000 people, that sort of scale, which was large in those days. And they would come together for winter and summer events, the solstice. That was a large part of why we got genetic variation, because you weren't screwing your cousin. Okay, there were rules like the Australian Aborigines have now that were really based on learning what genetics actually is by experience rather than by research. So there's quite possible those societies did make a established place that people return to. And some of the interpretation he makes about the lines looking like it's lines of meteors showering down, that makes sense to me as well. But a lot of the other stuff,
Mm.
hold my opinion.
Yeah, no, interesting. But I mean, when it comes to economics, though, you've got probably the most important factor of where we live. Everything that we live is dictated by economics. You know, all the
Yeah,
realities of our life have been dictated by this mythical pattern of economics, which we've been led to believe. So some of the ones, and the one that became popular that no one seemed to realize before groups like Positive Money started to really promote the
yeah.
message, you know, and this was how the banking sector worked. And this, I remember when I discovered it, because I had to write articles on it. Like it was like this kind of blowing the lid off something that, you know, this concept that you've grown up believing. But
Exactly.
the old lady went in and put her savings in the savings account. I think my mum still thinks this is how it works.
Most people do, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is mind blowing, really. But you know, this idea that they put it in the savings account, and then the bank counts up all its pennies that are in the trove in the basement, you know, and then decides when, you know, the businessman comes in how much that they can lend to the businessman. You've got this kind of like circular economy, and
Yeah.
this was kind of what was blown out by 2008, because as the years went on, you had Positive Money came in as their solution as to why 2008 shouldn't have happened, and we got to control the banking sector. And then the Bank of England came clean about it.
In
Take up the
2014. Yeah.
yeah, take up the story of that, because that's one thing that needs to.
Yeah, that's probably one of the most crucial errors in mainstream economics is the banking sector. And what they argue is they call the model, they call it loanable funds. And in loanable funds, banks are just intermediaries. They call them financial intermediaries. Now, a financial intermediary enables other people to do something through the intermediary. So their vision is that if Steve goes and gets a bank loan, what's actually happening is Catherine is lending money to Steve. So Catherine's got less money in the account, Steve's got more. Steve can spend more, Catherine can spend less. And then if Steve repays the debt, Catherine can spend more and Steve can spend less. And at the aggregate level, there's no particular influence. That's literally what you'll find in textbooks, and you'll find it, in the work of Ben Bernanke as well, my favorite
Still,
idiot in
that's still
economics.
that's still in
That's
economics.
still there. I mean, when Ben Bernanke got the fucking, pardon the French, fucking Nobel Prize in economics for his work on banking, I was disgusted. That was 8 years after the Bank of England came out and sided with the rebel side, that was my side, saying that model's nonsense, doesn't work. He gets the Nobel Prize for that model, and in the lecture he gave, he talked about how banks enable the ultimate savers to lend to the ultimate borrowers, meaning people putting their money in are the savers, and the people borrowing it are the borrowers. The banks are just intermediaries. Same old model. He did not even quote or refer to the Bank of England paper or the Bundesbank one that came out shortly afterwards. Neither of the so-called scientific documents supporting it put out by the Nobel Committee. So they just simply ignore what they don't want to know. And this is one reason why I'm becoming even more abusive towards them, because it's just ridiculous that this thing hasn't been thrown out, because it's provably wrong. And in several senses, but one is that if it was true, you would never have had 2008.
Mm. The other one that I get a lot of emails about this from people, or I get people talking to me about it on the phone, and that is that, you know, they sort of envisage that there's this period of hyperinflation coming because of the amount of bank printing that's out there, and somehow we're going into this government debt is a XXX amount, and then they throw out this number, of course, which is, you know, just like this and whenever you get something over, you know, like the amount of government debt there is, it's just like, no, counting this number. I have
Yeah.
no idea what it is, you know. And then what will happen if the debt ceiling is reached and the US doesn't do
Yeah.
then then the US will go and the dollar's going to crash, and then, you know, this kind of like
And it gives an explanation, even though
a
the company, most people have built their lives around that explanation or explanation of that nature. If you come along and say, I'm sorry, your foundations are wrong, they don't want to know. And this isn't just economists now, it's people who swallowed that particular view. So, like since I got involved in all this fight, I've built a software package called Ravel, which I know you're aware of. It used to be called Minsky. And Ravel includes the capacity to build models of monetary transactions using double entry bookkeeping. And if you put the vision that the textbooks teach, which is that Catherine lends to Stephen when a loan takes place, and you run that model, and you then have the government running a deficit, so it's also borrowing from Catherine. Therefore, Catherine's got less money to invest in Steve, and therefore I can invest less, etc., etc. You
Do you
do
have it
get
on
that.
your computer? Do you have it on your
Yeah.
computer now?
Do you want to have a look?
Do you want to share screen
Yeah,
and
sure. Just give me a sec to bring up the program. I've got to. I'll just find the actual. Let's see.
to do it?
Okay. I'll just open the file location where I've now got a copy of
Because
that.
I think it's so important for people to understand this, because
It is, but it's. I
they're
mean, I can do this like.
frightened.
I'm happy to do it live with you and make the point. Okay.
Yes,
So I'm just loading the program now on
because
my other
I
screen.
saw you do an excellent voiceover of this to what they were reporting on
Yeah, well, I mean, I've got a great team doing editing for me now, so they would have edited out a lot of the detail, unfortunately. So at least your viewers, I can actually show the full exercise there. So can you see my screen now?
I can see something, but not your.
Now just where
Oh,
I've
there
got
you
a.
go. That's it. You've got it
Yeah,
now.
yeah. I've saved. I've stuffed myself up because I've actually I made a mistake in that particular. Hang on, I've got to find another one. That one had an error in the way I hadn't finished putting all the accounting together. So just give me a second.
No worries.
Pardon me.
Your screen's going to be a lot more shareable than mine is, which is it's not very well filed.
Okay, let's see. Loanable funds with government, not that one. So I'll find this one, and this should be better. Let's see. Tick, tick, tick. Okay, now you're seeing my screen there. So what I've got here, and I'll show people the overall vision that the conventional mob have. So their idea is that you put money, you and I both deposit money in the bank account. So that becomes private sector deposits. So there's 100 in reserves, there's 90 in the private sector, and banks have got 10. The banks have to have some equity. And then what you have is when the government spends, of course, when the government spends, it must reduce the money in its account and increase in the private sector. That's the deficit running there. Tax goes the opposite direction. Then if the government spends more than it takes back in taxation, it's required to sell bonds. So the money from bonds goes from the private sector back to the government again. And then because the government's sold those bonds, have got to pay interest on them. And then the amount of bonds issued by law are required to be equal to the deficit, which is the gap between spending and tax plus the interest. So that's the model that they've got. The rest of this just ties the rest of the logic together. Now, what it means is if the government is selling bonds to the private sector, then for the private sector, the bonds are actually their asset. Okay, so I'll show the private sector table in a bit more detail. So in the private sector, government spending increases the net worth of the private sector. Taxation reduces it. Interest payments increase it, and spending by banks increases it. But the selling of bonds reduces the amount of money in the bank accounts and increases the monetary value of the bonds that the private sector has at the same time. So that's the overall logic there. Now, if I run this model, and the point about what the government is required to do, by the way, is just down here. If the government spending is greater than taxation, then that's what I've got here. So 55.8 billion is being sent and 54 billion tax. The deficit is 1.8 billion, and the government is required to issue bonds that are equal to the deficit plus interest on existing bonds. And I'm starting this from zero, so there's no interest to begin with. Now, in that situation, I've set it up. This is just up in the top bit up here. So I've got the government spending 1% of GDP more than it's taking back in taxation. So it spends 31% and takes back 30%. Okay, so if I run that model, and I'll run it now, you see that there's no change to GDP because we're just shuffling the amount of money around. But look at the government debt ratio, it's rising exponentially, and so are interest payments. And you can see the number of years on the bottom. So after 30 years, the government debt's 70% of GDP. After 40, it's 130%. Keep on going, it'll hit a couple of 1,000% of GDP. This is an obvious catastrophe. You can't let it happen. It won't occur. Well, long before this happened, the private sector say we're not going to buy your bonds anymore. So all the crisis comes out of this model. Okay. Now the trouble is, it's wrong. Okay, it's not true that the government sells bonds to the private sector. Okay, it's not true that the government banks at private banks. they have some bank accounts there, but predominantly the government banks at the central bank. And the private, rather than selling bonds to the private sector, it sells it to the banks. So I can just rapidly, with my software, this is the only program that enables you to do this, I can say it's not correct. Let's just dive in here. It's not true to say that bonds are an asset of the private non-bank sector. So I can delete that. And then I can come up to the table for the banks and say, giving an extra room for an extra column there. Now I've forgotten what I called that bloody account. This is where I made the mistake on the previous one. So it's going to dive back out a bit and see what it's called in terms of the, I've got to keep on going. I'll take a risk. I think I was called it bonds.
To know.
Okay, that's what I called it. Okay, so now that's been brought across, and so the bonds are now an asset of the banking sector, and the government doesn't bank at the private banks; it banks at the central bank. So I create the government account as an extra liability for the central bank, and now I've got to say, well, it's not true that the bond sales are made to the private sector, so I delete that transaction, and they don't get the interest either, so I delete that. And now I've got to go through here and say, well, I've got half the thing done for the central bank, but these things aren't yet allocated. It has to be a double entry for everything. So I will have to type interest here. So interest on bonds increases bank reserves. Selling bonds reduces bank reserves. So reserves are used to buy the bonds, in other words. Spending by the government increases reserves. And taxation reduces reserves. So all I've done so far is I've just say, you've got the structure wrong. The Earth is not the center of the solar system, the sun is. That's effectively what I've done here. I've got to do one more thing. I've got to show the interest is paid to the banks. So I need to type that inside here. And then in this extremely simple model, just to make it possible to go from one to the other very quickly, I just assume that banks spend all the interest income they get, and that's what this little switch down here has. So in the previous model, I had banks not spending at all because they didn't get any of the cash flow. If I flick this switch, they now get interest and they spend it. So I can stick with I can make a more complicated model that have the same impact. That's just doing it more simply. So all I've done is say, you've allocated two assets wrongly. You've got the government bank account at the wrong institution, and you've got the wrong sector buying the bonds. All I've done is fix that up. Everything else remains the same. Hit run. And I have no tax. Sometimes tax doesn't get fixed up here. So I've got to type minus tax over here as well. Okay, there we go. That's fixed up. Now hit run. Exactly the same. Notice what's changed. GDP is rising. Okay? Because the government spending in excessive taxation is creating more money in private bank accounts than it's taking out. That money is turned over, the economy grows. Consequently, the government interest debt ratio, which was rising exponentially in the previous model, is now going to taper. It's going to converge to 50% of GDP. And the reason it'll converge to that is because of the velocity of money assumption I've made down here. If I increase the velocity of money, that ratio is going to fall. And if I decrease the velocity of money, that ratio is going to rise. Okay, so it's all that ratio doesn't depend upon government behaviour. It's how fast money turns over in the economy. So when you change across and say this is the real world, there is no government debt crisis. Okay, you will not reach that terrible future. So this is why it's so important to get the structure right. And my Ravel is literally the only program on the planet that enables you to do that. If the mainstream were actually interested in money, they would have invented something like this decades ago. They're not, and they haven't done it.
Is one of the reasons that they haven't done it because if you keep that idea going about government debt, then you also have to keep the idea going about how we fund governments. That taxation
it changes the whole thing. I mean, taxation, and this is you would have heard of modern monetary theory. Modern monetary theory is compatible with what I argue, except in its work on international trade, which I regard as nonsense. But when government spending, they say the government doesn't tax to spend, it spends to tax. Taxation doesn't finance government spending, it simply takes excess government money creation out of circulation. Because if you go back to the days that Donald Trump wants to return us to, when you could finance government spending with tariffs alone, the government in America at that time, people are going to be surprised by this, I'm sure. the government spending as a fraction of GDP in the 1800s in America was never greater than 5% of GDP and normally below 3%. So at that level, you didn't need to get excess money, government money creation out of circulation because it wasn't excess. That's roughly the rate of growth of the economy, so you can handle that level of government deficit spending. But when you have the government being 30% of GDP, 10 times as much as it was in the 19th century, if you left all that money in circulation, then you would have blowout in the money supply. Okay, no, so you've got it. You tax to stop a blowout in the money supply. You don't tax to stop to fund government spending. And then it becomes, why do you tax incomes? At the moment, people think taxing incomes is that's my contribution to government expenditure. No, it's not. It's the government taking money out of your account to reduce the rate of growth of the money supply from what it would be if they didn't do that. And then the trouble is, of course, the wealthy can evade tax and the poor can't. So you get to the situation we're in these days where, working class people are voting right wing because they can see the tax coming out of their paychecks. They can't see the impact of government spending on the other side. And we'd be better off if we went to something like, I hate to say it, even Pauline Hanson I agree with Pauline Hanson on something, a transactions tax would be better. Where everything you bought, literally every time you bought anything, not VAT, everything had a tax attached to it. That would ultimately cause the same cancellation of money creation as we currently do through income tax, but it wouldn't generate the right-wing backlash that we've got that's come over the last 40 or 50 years.
Mm. Well, I mean, you could do that because I've had conversations with Warren Mosler as well, and his idea is that we just have a flat 10%, I think it's 10% property tax and nothing else, which sparked my interest because I thought, oh, that's rather a George's thing. But then he wants it on property values, not just on land values. We got into quite a conversation about it because
Yeah.
because
Well,
the idea of having a property tax, the idea of having a land tax, of course, is to stimulate, is to stop hoarding of land and to stimulate building activity and to lower rents because you stimulate building activities, so it keeps
yeah,
rents low, and then to keep prices low because if you tax land, no one's, like in Victoria's proven in such a brilliant part of couldn't have proven it better than what Victoria's done. It's ramped up land tax a little bit, and all the investors have scurried away.
have
And
they? Okay, I
yeah,
wasn't
yeah,
aware of that.
yeah. They put up they lowered the threshold, so they basically brought a whole heap more people into the land tax bubble, and then they kind of put it as the COVID debt repayment. So we're all paying more land tax, and that just
Yeah,
investors say, well, hang on a second, capital growth is not outweighing that land tax. It's making it like, why am I holding a property? I'm not getting rental income, isn't positively getting, I mean, it's gone up.
yeah.
So they're like, well, we'll sell out, and then investors are saying, well, we're not going to buy in Victoria, we'll go and buy in, well, they're at the moment they're buying in Darwin, believe it or not. They
Lucky Darwin.
bloody
Yeah,
good to
yeah,
Darwin, but we'll go and buy in Perth, or we'll go and buy where the land tax is lower. So the market's kind of turned into a home buy market. So I mean, land tax did what it was supposed to do here. I
yeah,
mean,
yeah.
it got investors to sell and took speculation out of the market. And Melbourne's median property price is now sixths down from where it was. It's no longer Sydney. It's no longer Sydney, Melbourne, and then all the others. It's Sydney. I don't know who's next actually, which I should do. Brisbane, I think, and then
I guess, yeah,
Perth,
yeah.
and then Adelaide, and Canberra, and then Melbourne. Something like
Well,
that.
see, this is what's politically necessary because so many people have made their fortunes out of land speculation and out of rising property prices that's like politically locked in. The Labor Party these days. It just disgusts me, frankly, with that most recent policy of theirs. So the current politicians are all voting in favour of continuing the house price bubble. But if you get, there's such a percentage of the population now that can't even consider to buy a home. The age of people, first home buyers used to be in their 20s, now in their 40s. When you get to the stages 50s and 60s, forget about it. The majority will want house prices to fall. So politically, the pressure is going to be in favour of the sort of things that the Victorian government did that I wasn't aware they have done, so good on them. But yeah, something to stop this speculative land bubble because it's got to the point, as I showed in that video you probably saw, that it used to take 4.5 years income to buy a house in Sydney, and now it takes 12.
Mm.
The average person income earner buying the average home. It's this average income for New South Wales versus home price in Sydney, so it's not completely a fair comparison. But Sydney is most of New South Wales population anyway. What it means is that back when I was a young man, a long time ago, 50 years ago, if I'd saved 4 years' income, I could have bought a house outright. Fast forward now, same person, I'd need to wait 12 years. And that's ultimately, it means we're going to have a land-owning class and a non-land-owning class, and that's feudal. That's more feudalism than capitalism. So anything that can end that is going to become politically palatable, given the demographic shift that now the youngest person who can afford to buy a house out of their income is now in their 50s.
Well, that's why I would say to you, if you've got a transaction tax, then why not do what Mosler says and do it as a property tax?
Could do. Yeah, I mean, I'm not against property tax by any means. You simply want to find means to take money out of circulation. That's what it is.
Hmm.
And therefore, it doesn't have to be income tax. It can be transaction tax, it can be land tax, other things, which mean you're simply reducing the amount of money in circulation. And like the ultimate vision there is that money is the only thing in a capitalist economy that doesn't depreciate, which is a mistake because it defies the laws of thermodynamics in that sense.
Mm.
Everything decays over time except your bank account. And Gazelle made that case almost a century, well, over a century ago. Same for the chemist Soddy. Both said money should depreciate over time, and
Mm.
therefore money would be like everything else. Everything else wears out. Why should not money? And therefore you wouldn't get the financial bubbles we get in the system. And we need a redesigned form of money. And partially the idea of reforming taxation so it doesn't come out of income, but it comes out of other things is a track towards treating that as a system of taking money out of circulation, not as a way of financing government spending.
Well, of course, I mean that the Georgist idea was that you tax away what you don't earn. So you prevent
Yeah.
monopoly, because once you take monopolies out of the system, then you have like a true market economy. Now,
Yeah, I'm not going to swallow that one because the whole idea of monopolies being the bad boys, it's just that's another product of neoclassical theory. But basically, what you're taking out is a feudal style system that land. uh, If you own land, you can extract a rent. It's unearned income. That's Michael Hudson's focus, of course.
hmm.
So if we have a system which promotes unearned income, we're going to end up in a speculative economy, not a productive one.
Well, that's the monopoly that Georgism will be talking about. It's the
Yeah,
monopolization of land, which would be all of the minerals, as well as
yeah.
the electromagnetic sphere. Whatever it is
Yeah,
that sort of
there's plenty of
are
stuff
able
that
to
people use to make money that they
enclose.
did. There's stuff people make money out of stuff they didn't create.
Mm.
And the whole idea of the land taxes say you didn't increase the population of Melbourne. The increase in the population is why your price has risen because there are more people in your suburb. You didn't build the train lines. That's why your prices have gone up because there's now a train to the city. All these things are public things which have increased the notional value of your land, but it's not you that did it. So we're taxed to take that away. And what's created by the public sector stays as a public benefit rather than being privately appropriated.
Yes, I now crown you a Georgist. You've now passed the
Oh, look,
qualification.
I have, when I haven't actually read Henry George. One of the holes in my reading is there's about four books that I should have read that I haven't read yet. But I've had Henry George explained to me by Georgists. And when I sit back and say, well, that's basically Ricardo's theory of rent.
This, yes, yeah,
Okay, now,
it is.
yeah,
The way he
yeah,
explained it.
yeah. So
I mean, he explained
that,
it in such. I mean, the real key really to selling economics is to be able to explain it in such a way that you explain it to the simple man on the street, because then, you know, they're not going to fight against what you do economically. That was kind of like George's his skill. When he wrote the book Social Problems, and it was his
yeah.
way of really like hitting to the heart of the matter.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm trying to do the same thing, I suppose, today,
Yeah,
but not quite so. Well, much more analytically in that sense
yeah.
than George did.
But
And
I
I
don't.
think,
I want you to explain, because this was one thing that I hadn't come across before, and it was on a video that I watched, and that was the myth of interest. Do you know what I'm talking about? Like
oh
with
yeah, 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 yeah. Okay. So people believe that because the bank lends you money, and you've got to pay interest on it, you've got to pay back the interest every year. All you've got is the principal, and therefore you've got to go back and borrow the difference, and ultimately the debt explodes. That's the basic. That's another fallacy, and that's a fallacy from confusing stocks and flows. So if you're looking at your money, the bank account you've got, it tells you how many dollars you have. It doesn't tell you how many dollars per year you have. Okay, the dollars are stock. The spending you do over a year is a flow. So if you borrow, this is just again hypothetical numbers, borrow $100 from a bank, start a business that generates $200 worth of revenue per year. Okay, now we've gone from dollars to dollars per year. You're supposed to pay 10% interest to the bank, let's say. So you owe them $10 per year. You're turning over $200 per year. If you can hire workers to do that work for you for $180 per year, then you get $180 in wages. You have $10 you pay to the bank per year as interest, and you make $10 profit per year. So even though it is the route to chaos ultimately, bank lending, it does not break down just because banks charge interest. Okay, it's a confusing a stock and a flow, and I can easily show that in my Ravel software again. Just show somebody borrowing money from a bank, hiring workers, producing output, and then servicing the debt over time. It's not an automatic runaway, and so there's so many elements of people's thinking which comes out of poor mathematical sophistication, I suppose, but it's a poor mathematical sophistication encouraged by mainstream economics that obscures all this stuff in the first place. And people say, what you've got is a cognitive dissonance, because the textbooks tell you it's all perfect and nothing ever goes wrong. Okay? And then you're living in the real world. Hang on, what's going on here? There's got to be something wrong. And so people reach for another explanation, and that is one I've seen people reach for. It's equally wrong, but it gives you an explanation for why the system stuffs up, and people become dedicated to that, even when you try to show them that it's intellectually false.
And the kind of bottom line of those two equations, which is the government spending and how the government, spends and what they tax and so forth, and then the banks, is that government debt is not the problem, it's private debt. Because it's
Yeah,
all private debt that pops the land bubble at the end of it, right? Where people suddenly that you've undermined the productive sectors of the economy through the vast majority of lending going through to real estate speculation, which is extremely unproductive,
yep,
particularly when you're not, building anything, or you're just sitting and land banking a property or land banking some land. And then, at some point, interest rates need to increase because of the natural cycle of things. They want to stem housing speculation or whatever it is. It's kind of like housing causes this kind of cost push inflation, if you like, because as land prices rise, the cost of doing business rises, because land is the foundation of everything that we do everything on, right? So
yeah.
the last thing that you want is high input costs with land. But that ultimately is what pops the bubble at the end, is the private debt. We can't
Oh
afford
yeah, private debt's the problem, and this is the other side. I mean, I began my work on private debt rather than government because I was attempting to model Hyman Minsky's financial instability hypothesis, and that was entirely about the dynamics of private debt. So what I did to model it, I took a model of a cyclical economy, which is what we live in. The economy is not in equilibrium; it's cyclical, and then I added a banking sector to it. And in this model, what I had was capitalists borrowing money from banks to build factories. So it was not real estate speculation, it was genuine investment taking place. And even in that system, there was a potential for the level of private debt to overwhelm the capacity of the people who'd borrowed to service that, and you'd have a financial breakdown. So that's what I did back in '92. I first built that model then. Oh, pardon me. I'm pretty certain this is going to be a scam. So I'll just actually, how do I turn the damn thing off?
oh,
Send it to
sorry,
voicemail.
your
Okay,
phone
yeah.
going off. Yeah.
I get this thing saying, we're worried about your tax situation. And then it says, press 1 for English, press 2 for Chinese.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah, okay. Anyway, so goodbye to that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and of course, it was that really kind of gave you the heads up of when you monitor that, then it becomes a leading indicator for the downturn.
Yeah,
Is
and
lending. Yeah.
I mean, because I developed that work back in the early '90s, in '92, when I first built the model, and then I got my job at Western Sydney. I wrote Debunking Economics. I got involved in huge battles with neoclassical economists over some of the arguments I made in that book. So I dropped the ball. I didn't look at the debt level until 2005, when I was approached by the New South Wales Legal Aid Commission to help out somebody who'd been hit by 6 consecutive predatory loans from
Mm.
a guy whose nickname is Criminalizer. You might know of him. This is a solicitor doing lending because the guy couldn't get any bank loans at that stage. The banks quite rightly turned him down. Criminalizer gave him 7 consecutive loans and then sued him for the house on the 7th loan. And so I got involved, and part of the case I made was, as an expert witness for the for the legal aid was that this sort of lending has deleterious impacts upon third parties because people who are not party to the contract get caught in speculative bubbles and house price crashes and so on. So I made that case, and the Legal Aid Commission was successful. But in doing it, I then looked at the data on private debt again. And I wrote, as an expert witness, as you probably know yourself, you're not allowed to use hyperbole. Anything you say must be able to be backed up. So I'd written a line saying the debt to GDP ratio has been rising exponentially. And I thought I can't use that word. It'll be something less than exponential. Then I plotted the data for Australia, and it was fitted an exponential curve like a glove. The ratio of private debt to GDP was rising exponentially from 1965 or thereabouts to 2005. Did the same thing for the American data. That went back further to 1945 to 2005. And I looked at it and thought, holy shit, this can't keep on going. At some point, there has to be a break. Therefore, credit will go negative. That will cause a recession, a serious one, the worst since the Great Depression. Somebody has to warn about it. At least in Australia, I was the somebody. That's what dragged me in there. So private debt is the thing we need to worry about, not government debt. And this is not an intentional mistake by the mainstream, but it's one of the consequences of their stupid model, that it gets us not to look at what actually causes the main forms of volatility in a capitalist economy.
Mm. Well, I mean, on that, I can't really let you go without giving me a forecast for where things stand now, because I mean
Mm.
I mean I write things based on timing and cycles. So
Yeah.
although I can look at all of these things and say, oh, this is a leading indicator, we can sort of see it, you're very much reading it from your experience in private debt. I mean, have you looked at where we are right now and thought,
It's not, what we're in is a period where there's far too much private debt. The government policy after the global financial crisis was to get us back into private debt again.
mm,
So if you look at Bernanke and these idiots who run the Federal Reserve, neoclassicals, therefore they're idiots, don't care what their IQ was before they went in. They've had a lobotomy by believing mainstream economics. But they argued the whole reason for quantitative easing is they thought it would lead banks to lend the money out, okay, and it would encourage people to borrow money. Okay.
mm,
Now, firstly, it's not possible for banks to lend out reserves. That's another myth. And secondly, the debt crisis was caused by private debt. You want more private debt? Okay.
mm,
It shows how brain dead that particular approach to economics is. But to have a real crisis, what you have to have is a high level of private debt and a high rate of growth of private debt, which then turns negative when you have a bust like the Lehman Brothers bust hitting and so on. And we don't have a high level of credit-based demand. In fact, credit-based demand in America right now, I think, is about the 4 or 5% of GDP level rather than 15%. So if you're not at a high level of credit, you can't have a huge plunge. And so you're
mm,
not going to get the serious downturn that we've seen in the past. But what you have is stagnation, because with that level of private debt, banks really don't want to lend much more. They're already a bit worried. Private sector, you look at the thing, oh my God, that's a lot of money I've got to borrow to buy that house. We want to do it. The reluctance turns up. So what you get is not a collapse, but what I call credit stagnation. So that's, I think, where we are in terms of the credit system. But what is likely to cause a financial crisis, and this comes back to the other thing we mentioned at the beginning, is insurance pulling out of so many housing markets, because once you get a gigantic climate change event coming through, and we're seeing that in Florida right now, so you can't get home insurance in Florida anymore. That will just cut out the foundation for all those markets. So we're
mm,
likely to see it come through the insurance sector, and global warming's impact upon the economy. The thing is, the government can continue propping this shit up forever. Uh,
mm,
and that's why I don't expect a house price crash in that sense. But what I that the work that the work economists done on climate change makes everything else they've done look like Tolstoy.
mm.
It's just appallingly stupid material that politicians have taken seriously because they trust economists, which is the worst mistake you can possibly make. And therefore, climate change is going to be far more damaging than politicians believe. And when that starts turning up, then I think it's goodbye to the entire private financial system when that happens.
It's interesting because I was mentioning it to you before we hit record, but I did an interview with Melody Wright, who's a US housing commentator, but she works in the finance over there. She's got a lot of experience, and she was sort of around when 2008 was happening. So she's quite informed on lending practices, and she was
Yeah.
talking about the level of mortgage fraud that's happening right now.
In
So
the States again?
in the
Yeah.
States, yeah, because they've got this first home buyer program over there, and I cannot
Oh no.
remember the way that it's actually really similar to what's happening over here. It's very interesting because it is a government backed subprime thing similar to what we've got, but of course designed
Yeah.
slightly differently. And she said that there's people that buy using this that aren't first home buyers, that it's meant for home buyers, but they're not first home buyers, that they
Mm.
find ways to utilize it. And so her forecast is quite different. She's saying that, she's seeing all of that taking place, and then she's seeing, particularly in Florida, that, just like tens of thousands of homes have been built that are just stood vacant, that cannot be sold.
Mm.
And she sort of sees these as the factors that are going to come together, and she thinks that it could be a crisis that is worse than 2008. So it's quite surprising to hear you say that. I thought you were going to give more of a dire scenario, but I guess we'll have to
Well,
wait and see.
just wait. I mean,
Yeah,
largely, as soon as when I realized how the shit that economists written on climate change, that sort of took my focus away from the property market.
yeah,
So, I mean, I just dived back into that particular thing because when Albanese came out with that stupid bloody 5% deposit thing and we'll pay your mortgage insurance, I thought he's not the prime minister; he's the prime real estate salesman. And
yeah, it's a
and like,
classic.
and he did his economics degree at a department that I fucking created,
Yes.
Department of Political Economy at Sydney University. So it was particularly insulting to see that sort of shit being pumped out by somebody who should know better.
Yeah, and it's very popular. I've got a lot, in
I'm
the
sure it is.
business,
Yeah,
I've got a whole host of first home buyers that I've not had before, that are all coming in buying with a 5% deposit, and it's caused this kind of, because when you turn up to an auction, you typically have to buy with 10%. You've got
yeah,
all these first home buyers turning up, not having no clue, because Albanese said, "Oh, you go out. Here's your 5%. You go out and you can buy with 5%, and don't worry, it's all good." And they're turning up at these house auctions and winning the auction, and then going,
not allowed in the room.
I
Yeah.
only got 5%, to sort of give you all. It's got to be subject to finance. It's quite funny, but yeah, it's been criticised. It was criticised by Louis Christopher quite a lot, because the
Yeah.
Treasury underestimated how much it would put property prices up by. They
Of,
said, "Oh, it'll only
of
cost
course they
us."
do. They haven't got a bloody clue. They're neoclassical economists.
Yeah, just classic, it'll
Yeah.
cost a tiny percentage rise, and of course you've got this like fire under the market, and there's not a lot of stock on the market, so yeah, it'd be interesting to see how it plays out.
Mm.
But anyway, thank you, Steve. I know that it was short notice. I always reach out, but I'm really grateful. And what can you give a plug to the course that you do that we were talking about?
Yeah, there's a course which is advertised by my YouTube videos, and the website for it is stevekeen.com, so it's quite easy to find. The marketing is heavy-handed. I can't control that. Please don't get turned off by it, because ultimately it does lead to a course that I'm teaching, which has about 800 people have signed up for it already, and it's a fabulous group of people. I thoroughly enjoy lecturing to them each week, and it's giving a realistic perspective on economics. I am changing the offering. It says 7 weeks. In fact, the current course I'm teaching is over 60 weeks. However, in response to some people coming in and finding themselves, down in the entrails of some of my mathematical logic and freaking out, it's a classic case. You can't see the forest for the trees. So I am writing a genuine 7-week lecture series, which I'm trialing it right now, and I'll likely have it finished by the end of November, let's say. So that course, you'll come and get eight lectures. I'm starting with an overview of the overview, then 7 lectures in each major topic, and that will be available starting in beginning of December, let's say. And yeah, and that'll be palatable for most people. It still is intense, okay, because you know, if I can use an analogy, you're signing up for a course with Galileo to learn how to use a telescope. Back in the days when people didn't know what a telescope was. So got to be something complicated. But it'll give you an overview for economics that'll change your perspective on how the economy operates to a much more realistic one. And then if you really enjoy that, then my gigantic lecture series, which is currently 60 weekly lectures and probably grow to 85 or 90, that'll be there as an option as well. So stevekeen.com, and I'm on Substack and Patreon as Prof. Steve Keen.
And I just want to emphasize to people, I mean, this opportunity that you're offering people. I mean, you were a professor in university. To actually access you prior to this period of time would have been, going through the university process, funding a great university program,
Yeah.
going on to the lectures each week. And what you're actually offering people is extremely unique, because I don't think there's anyone else out there that's quite got your breadth of knowledge. And like you say, that it comes with the program, doesn't it? That they can.
Yeah, they get my Ravel software as well, so they can use that, like the thing I showed a moment ago, which is the modeling side of Ravel. They get how to learn how to use that, and they get a copy as well. And there's also the data analysis side, which is something I'm hoping to commercialize. I'm still in the early days of doing that. So yeah, it's and it's a community. I mean, the people inside have become close friends. It's been quite remarkable to watch. I socialize with them now. There's one guy who lives in Holland, and he's taking me off to a live event in a couple of days' time here. So it's a marvelous group of people as well, highly stimulating, great discussions taking place there on, it's a school site, SKOOL. So yeah, you get a lot more than, you get a very different perspective on economics. Nobody else runs a course like I do, the level of depth. You do have Stephen Hale in Adelaide teaching a course on modern monetary theory. And a master's level degree, that's feasible. But again, that's a master's thesis. You've got to say master's fees. This tends to be, I don't know what price they set, the company handles that, but it's between $500 and $1,000 for, what'll be 8 intense lectures. And then the big one is much the same thing for 80 lectures. So I think it's a good deal.
I think it's excellent. I mean, I think this is almost the way of education now, because as you've said so many times, the worst thing that you can do if you want to learn about economics is actually go to a university and do an
Absolutely.
because you're just
Yeah.
going to learn inaccurate information and come out looking like a fool, So, I mean, this, and also for my subscribers, I mean, we talk about cycles, and I have all sorts of brilliant cycle analysts that come on and give us exceptional pinpoints of timing. But the thing that causes the cycle when we see housing prices drop is the economics that's behind it. And if you don't understand the economics that's behind it, you're not really going to have a full grasp of how to read a cycle, how to take advantage of a cycle if that's what you want to do, and the most important thing, of course, is how to eliminate a cycle. And
Exactly.
to understand how government policy impacts a cycle, to understand how government spending impacts a cycle. So this is why I think it's so brilliant that you've got the opportunity to offer this. So that's great, and I'll put it in the report that I send out with this. I'll put a link to it, so people can potter off and have a look and fill their minds with mathematical.
Which actually I can even offer you a freebie if you like.
Oh, well,
Would you like to?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, that would
Okay.
be fantastic. Yeah.
I give a lecture. The lecture, I give one at 1 p.m. New York time on a Wednesday and 6 p.m. Sydney time on a Thursday. And I'm not doing that. Actually, I am doing that this week because that's 10 o'clock in the morning or 9 o'clock in the morning for me over here. So I'll pop you a freebie and come along and join us.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Very, very much appreciated. Well, anyway, I'll call it up because I know you've got to run off to the next one that's coming up. But yeah, as always, thank you so much, and we will do it again.
Absolutely, Catherine. Good to chat to you again. Okay, bye.
See you soon. Bye.